It's the 8th of January, 871, a frozen hillside somewhere in the Berkshire Downs. The wind cuts across chalk grassland, and a solitary thorn tree, stunted, barely waist-high, stands bent against the cold. Below the ridge, a 22-year-old prince stares uphill at 1,000 Scandinavian warriors who've already beaten him once that week. His brother, the king, is supposed to be beside him. He isn't. He's in a tent behind the lines, on his knees, hearing mass, and he has told his officers he will not come out until the priest has finished. The Danes begin to move. Alfred, not yet great, not yet a legend, not yet anything more than the youngest son of a dead king, has a choice. Wait for his brother, or charge a shield wall uphill into the teeth of a Viking army. He charged. What happened around that thorn tree on that bitter January morning would be remembered as the first major defeat of the great heathen army on English soil. But what most people don't know is that Ashdown wasn't a single heroic moment. It was one battle in the middle of 6, fought across barely 5 months, in a winter campaign so brutal that it killed a king, destroyed a dynasty, and left the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom dangling by a thread. By the time the fighting stopped, 4 of 5 royal brothers would be dead. A warrior bishop would lie unburied on a battlefield, and a young man who could barely read until he was 12 would be paying his enemies to leave. This is how England almost ended. To understand how Alfred ended up on that hillside, you need to understand what had already been lost. In the autumn of 865, a fleet appeared off the coast of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Mysal Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. It wasn't a raiding party. It wasn't a summer expedition looking for plunder and a quick sail home. This was something England had never seen before, a Scandinavian invasion force that intended to stay. Its leaders, according to later Norse tradition, were the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Whether or not they were actually Ragnar's sons is debatable. What isn't debatable is what they did. In 866, they took York. It fell on the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, while the Northumbrians were distracted by a civil war between 2 rival kings. By the time the Northumbrians scrambled to mount a counterattack 4 months later, it was too late. They marched on York, breached the crumbling Roman walls, and were slaughtered inside the city. Both Northumbrian kings died. The kingdom that had produced Bede, the greatest scholar in Europe, was finished. In 869, they turned on East Anglia. Its king Edmund was captured and killed. Later tradition says he was tied to a tree, shot full of arrows and beheaded, tortured for refusing to renounce Christianity. The stories grew so powerful that Edmund became a saint, and the town where he was buried became Bury St. Edmunds. Whether the martyrdom happened exactly as the legends describe is uncertain. What's certain is that Edmund died and East Anglia fell. The Third Kingdom, Mercia, bought time the only way it could. When the Vikings seized Nottingham in 867, the Mercian king Burgred begged Wessex for help. King Aethelred of Wessex marched north with his youngest brother, Alfred. They arrived, found the Vikings behind walls, and couldn't get them out. Mercia paid a Danegeld, a hefty bribe, and the Danes withdrew. For now, 3 kingdoms confronted, 2 destroyed, 1 humiliated into paying tribute. Only Wessex remained untouched. The boy who would have to save it had been unusual from birth. Alfred was born around 849 at the royal estate of Wantage, in the Berkshire Downs, the same chalk hills where he would one day fight for his life. He was the 5th and youngest son of King Aethelwulf, and by all accounts, his father's favorite. At the age of 4, Aethelwulf did something extraordinary. He sent the child to Rome. Pope Leo IV received the boy and, according to Asser, anointed him as king, though whether this was a genuine royal anointing or simply a confirmation ceremony, historians still argue about. Either way, a 4-year-old child stood before the Pope in Rome, and then came home to a kingdom that had no idea what was coming. His mother, Osburh, had planted a love of learning in him that would last his whole life. Asser records a famous story. She showed her sons a book of Saxon poetry, beautifully illuminated, and promised it to whichever boy could learn to read it first. Alfred won. He was 6 years old. The irony is that despite this early passion, he remained unable to read Latin, the language of scholarship, of the church, of everything that mattered. until he was well into his 30s. In Asser's words, his noble birth and noble nature implanted in him from his cradle a love of wisdom. But the tools to pursue that wisdom came agonizingly late. He also suffered from something else, a mysterious, debilitating illness that would plague him his entire life. Asser describes agonizing attacks of pain that struck without warning. The first episode hit at his own wedding feast. The nature of the condition has never been identified with certainty. Modern historians have suggested everything from Crohn's disease to severe piles. But whatever it was, it left Alfred periodically unable to function, racked with pain, convinced at times that God was testing him. It's an extraordinary detail. The man who would have to save England from the most dangerous invasion it had ever faced couldn't always trust his own body. None of that mattered in the winter of 870. What mattered was that Alfred could fight. Just after Christmas 870, the combined forces of Halfdan and a newly arrived warrior king named Bagsechi sailed up the Thames into the heart of Wessex and seized Reading. By this point, Ivar the Boneless and Ubba had both left England for new conquests. Ivar to Ireland, where he'd carved out a kingdom in Dublin, and Ubba to unknown destinations. But Halfdan remained, and the arrival of Bagsec's fresh army meant the Viking force in England was stronger than ever. Now, Reading in the 9th century wasn't anything close to a town. It was a royal ville, essentially a grand farm where the king's household stopped on its rounds. A hall, a church, a few barns, maybe 24 households. But its position was everything. It sat on a neck of land between the rivers Thames and Kennet, water protecting two sides. The Vikings dug a rampart and ditch across the third, creating an almost triangular fortress. Inside, they had a storehouse of grain and cattle, the Thames at their back as an escape route, and 1,000 seasoned warriors crammed into a space smaller than a modern football pitch. To understand how terrifying that was, you need to think about the numbers, and then forget everything you know about modern warfare. The whole of England in Alfred's time probably held around 1 million people, fewer than live in Birmingham today. Wessex itself perhaps had a few 100,000, scattered across farms, hamlets, and small estates. There was no standing army. The Anglo-Saxon fighting force, the Fyrd, was made up of farmers and minor landowners who owed military service to their lords. Men who had to be summoned by riders, gathered from across the Shire, equipped with whatever weapons they owned, and fed from whatever grain their communities could spare. It took days, sometimes weeks, to assemble. And once assembled, these men couldn't stay in the field indefinitely. They had farms to tend, harvests to bring in, families to feed. Against them sat a professional army of perhaps 1,000 warriors, concentrated in one place, behind fortifications. Experienced, disciplined, with nothing to do but fight. 3 days after seizing Reading, the Danes sent a foraging party commanded by 2 jarls west into Berkshire. They got as far as Englefield, about 6 miles out, where they ran straight into the local ealdorman, a Mercian by birth named Aethelwulf. He was a fascinating figure. Despite being from Mercia, he'd risen to become one of the most powerful nobles in Berkshire. He'd fought Vikings before. Back in 860, he'd driven a raiding force away from Winchester, and he was, by all accounts, a master of the ambush. With roughly 1,000 men, Aethelwulf hit the smaller Viking foraging party before they knew what was happening. One of the 2 jarls was killed. The survivors fled back to Reading. It must have felt, briefly, like good news. 4 days later, King Aethelred arrived with the main army of Wessex. His father had had 5 sons, and 3 were already dead, 2 having served as king. Aethelred, the 4th brother, had taken the throne in 865 at about 20 years old, just as the great heathen army arrived on English soil. At his side, as always, was the youngest brother, Alfred. It's the 4th of January, 871. The men of Wessex are outside Reading, staring at the Viking rampart. The day starts well. Danish forces pour out from behind the defenses to meet them, and the Anglo-Saxons drive them back along the ditch. For a moment, it looks like the fortress might fall. Then the gates swing open. Viking reinforcements hit the Anglo-Saxons from behind. Bishop Asser, writing Alfred's biography years later, claimed the Danes attacked like wolves. That's probably generous spin on what was, in plain terms, a rout. The army of Wessex broke and ran. Among the dead left in the mud outside, Reading was Ealdorman Aethelwulf, the ambush master who'd won at Inglefield just days before. His body was carried secretly back to Mercia and buried near Derby. The man who gave Wessex its first victory didn't even get to rest in West Saxon soil. But Aethelred and Alfred escaped. They knew the local terrain, the fords, the tracks, the river crossings, and found a way across the River Loddon about 8 miles east. They had 4 days to regroup, 4 days before the Danes came to finish it. On the morning of the 8th of January, Halfdan and Bagsec advanced from Reading to destroy what was left of the army of Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle places the battle at Ash's Hill, most likely Kingstanding Hill near Molesford, though some historians favor Lowbury Hill nearby. Whatever the exact spot, it was high ground on the Berkshire Downs, along an ancient track called the Ridgeway. And the Vikings got there first. Aethelred split his army into 2 divisions. He would face the 2 Viking kings, Halfdan and Bagsec. Alfred would tackle the Jarls. Despite the mauling both sides had taken at Reading, the men of Wessex probably outnumbered the Danes, perhaps 1,500 against 1,000. But the Vikings held the high ground, and the advantage of bitter experience, and then the king went to pray. Bishop Asser tells us that Aethelred withdrew to his tent, heard mass, and declared he would not leave that place alive before the priest had finished. His army stood in formation on the slope below a battle-hardened enemy. His 22-year-old brother waited, and the king prayed. Now, there are 2 ways to read this. The version Asser wrote, and Asser was Alfred's biographer, paid to make his patron look extraordinary, casts Aethelred as the pious king who trusted God, and Alfred as the courageous hero who couldn't wait. But there's another possibility. Aethelred was no fool. He'd fought the Vikings before, and knew how shield walls worked. By holding his fresh division back whilst Alfred's men engaged, he may have been deliberately resting his troops, waiting for the right moment, letting the Danes exhaust themselves against one half of his army before committing the other. We will never know which version is true. What we do know is that Alfred didn't wait. The Vikings began advancing downhill. Asser tells us that Alfred, though possessing a subordinate authority, could no longer support the troops standing idle. He formed his men into a shield wall, and, in Asser's famous phrase, charged uphill with the rush of a wild boar. A shield wall charging uphill against an entrenched enemy. Picture it. Men locked shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, scrambling over frozen chalk and tussock grass. And at the top, a line of Scandinavian warriors with axes and spears waiting to kill them. The courage, or desperation, that required is difficult to overstate. The fighting centered around that solitary stunted thorn tree on the hillside. Asser mentions it with an odd, almost personal aside. I have seen it with my own eyes. A bishop, years later, walking a bleak Berkshire hilltop to stand beside a twisted little tree because of what happened around it one winter morning. That detail, a man visiting a tree, says more about the weight of what occurred there than any dramatic narration ever could. Alfred's charge drove back the Jarl's division. The momentum of men running uphill, screaming, slamming into a shield wall with the full weight of desperation behind them. It was enough to buckle the Viking line and force them back. But the advantage didn't last. Halfdan and Bagsec, seeing their Jarl's division in trouble, swung around to hit Alfred's exposed flank. Suddenly he was fighting on 2 fronts, spears jabbing through the gaps in the shield wall, axes smashing at the rims, the deafening crash of wood and iron, the sheer suffocating weight of bodies pressing forward. Alfred's men were giving ground. Slowly, step by step, the thorn tree at their backs, they were being pushed down the hill they'd just fought their way up. At that moment, Aethelred emerged from his tent. His division hit the Vikings before they could reform. Fresh troops, slamming into an enemy already exhausted from fighting Alfred uphill and then downhill. The impact was devastating. The great heathen army broke. For the first time in 6 years of campaigning across England, they ran. The men of Wessex pursued them until darkness fell. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it simply. The Christians followed, slaying all they could reach, until it became dark. The pursuit resumed at dawn the next morning, chasing the bloodied survivors all the way back to the fortress at Reading. Among the Viking dead were Bagsec himself and 5 Jarls, Sidroc the Old, Sidroc the Younger, Osborne, Freyna, and Harold. The chronicle recorded that many thousands of pagans fell. It was the most complete English victory of the entire Viking invasion, and it meant almost nothing. 2 weeks later, at Basing, barely 20 miles south of Reading, the Vikings fought back and won. Neither the Chronicle nor Asser bothered recording the details. 2 months after that, in March, the armies clashed again at Merton. The men of Wessex fought all afternoon, shield wall against shield wall, and were winning. Then, late in the day, the line broke. Among the dead was Bishop Haymond of Sherborne, a warrior bishop who'd fought beside his king with a sword in his hand. They buried him at Keynsham in Somerset. He was later made a saint. His feast day is the 22nd of March, the day he died fighting. And then came the blow that changed everything. Shortly after Easter 871, King Aethelred died. He was somewhere between 24 and 28 years old. He left behind 2 infant sons, Ethelhelm and Ethelwold. We don't know exactly how he died. No chronicle records the cause. But given the timing, barely 3 weeks after Merton, where the fighting had been close and brutal, wounds sustained in battle seemed the likeliest explanation. He'd been king for barely 6 years. He'd spent most of them fighting. They buried him at Wimborne Minster in Dorset, a small stone church in the Dorset countryside. His tomb can still be seen there today, a simple brass plate on the wall, easily missed by visitors who don't know what they're looking at. The grave of a man who won the greatest victory over the Vikings that England had ever seen, and then died before he could build on it. His father had had 5 sons, 5 brothers, and now 4 of them were dead. The Witan, the council of nobles and churchmen, met to choose the next king. With a reinvigorated Viking army at Reading, swelled by the arrival of a massive fleet under a Danish warlord named Guthrum, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle calls it the Great Summer Army. They needed a man who could fight, not a child in a cradle. They chose Alfred, passing over Aethelred's 2 infant sons. It was a decision that would haunt the dynasty for decades. Ethelwold, the elder of those 2 passed-over sons, never forgot. 30 years later, he would raise a rebellion against Alfred's own son, Edward, and die fighting for what he believed was his stolen crown at the Battle of the Holm in 902. The seeds of that war were planted here, in the spring of 871, in the shadow of a dead king and an empty throne. Alfred was 22 years old. The last brother, the last hope. His first battle as king came within a month. At Wilton, on the south bank of the River Wylye, Alfred's outnumbered force held their line for most of the day. Late in the afternoon, the Vikings appeared to flee, then turned and counterattacked. Whether it was a deliberate feint or a desperate last stand that somehow worked, the result was the same. Alfred's army broke, and so Alfred did what other desperate kings had done before him. He paid. A Danegeld, tribute, protection money, call it what you will, to buy Halfdan's withdrawal from Wessex. In 6 months, the 2 sides had fought 6 major battles and, according to the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, 9 general engagements south of the Thames. And that's not counting the countless skirmishes, raids, and running fights that nobody bothered to record. Both armies were shattered. The fields of Berkshire and Wiltshire were soaked with blood. Halfdan, having lost his co-commander Bogsecgi, 5 jarls and uncounted warriors, retreated to London for the winter and then moved north to York. He wouldn't return to Wessex. Instead, in 873, he struck at Mercia. His forces sailed up the Trent, bypassed Nottingham, where, just 6 years earlier, Alfred and Aethelred had marched to defend their Mercian allies, and seized Repton. This wasn't just any Mercian town. Repton was the ancient burial place of Mercian kings, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, home to the royal crypt beneath St. Wyston's church, where generations of Mercian royalty lay interred. In modern terms, seizing it was roughly equivalent to a foreign army occupying Westminster Abbey. The psychological shock was devastating. King Burgred, who had ruled for 22 years and had once called on Wessex for help, simply gave up. He abandoned his throne and fled to Rome, where he died, a broken exile in a foreign land. Halfdan installed a puppet king named Ceolwulf in his place, a man the Anglo-Saxon chronicle dismisses as a foolish king's thane. Centuries later, archaeologists would dig up the Viking winter camp at Repton and find a mass grave beneath the ruins of St. Wyston's church. At least 249 bodies, 80% of them male, aged 15 to 45. Scattered among the bones were Viking weapons and artifacts. Whether these were warriors who died in battle or victims of disease, nobody knows for certain, but the sheer number of dead, piled together in the foundations of a Mercian holy place, tells its own story about what the great heathen army left behind. The army then split. Halfdan went north, ravaging the Picts and the kingdom of Strathclyde. Guthrum took his forces to Cambridge, and from there he looked south. In 865, 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had faced the Viking invasion: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex. Now 3 had fallen. 1 remained. Its king was 24. He'd lost more battles than he'd won. He'd already paid his enemies once to leave. He suffered from a mysterious, debilitating illness that struck without warning. Asser describes agonizing attacks of pain that left him unable to function, the first of which hit him on his own wedding day. And the fate of Anglo-Saxon England, of what would one day become England itself, rested entirely on him. Stand on the Berkshire Downs today, and you can still walk the Ridgeway, the ancient track that runs along the chalk hills where Ashdown was fought. The thorn tree is long gone. The rampart at Reading has vanished beneath a modern city. The bones of the men who fought there have been dust for 1,000 years. But what happened on that frozen hillside in January 871? A young prince charging uphill into a Viking shield wall because his brother wouldn't leave his prayers, set in motion everything that followed. Alfred's defeat at Wilton, his humiliating Danegeld, his years of desperate survival, and then, eventually, his extraordinary comeback at Edington in 878. The treaty with Guthrum, the creation of the Danelaw, the building of the burhs, the revival of learning, the forging of a single English identity from the wreckage of 4 shattered kingdoms. They gave him a crown and called him king. History would call him great. But in 873, standing alone against an army that had swallowed every kingdom it had faced, Alfred was simply the last one left, the 5th son, the spare of the spare of the spare, staring south from Cambridge at the last unconquered kingdom in England, and wondering how long he could hold. If you'd like to hear what happened next, and I promise you, it's worth hearing, I'll be covering Alfred's greatest crisis and his remarkable comeback in a future video. If you haven't already, do consider subscribing so you don't miss it. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.